According to his memoirs, Carter prayed fervently for a few minutes in private. Then he put on more formal clothes, he said, because of the gravity of the moment, and he marched down to Sadat's lodge. Speaking quietly but firmly, he told the Egyptian president that if he left now, it would mean the end of the relationship between Egypt and the US. It would mean the end of the US peacemaking effort, and it would probably mean the end of Carter's presidency. Not to mention, he said, quote, the end of something that is very precious to me, my friendship with you.
Hello, and welcome to the Creating History podcast and our series exploring pivotal summit meetings where leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, producer of television documentaries and now podcasts.
And I'm David Reynolds, author and historian.
In this episode, we look at one of the most dramatic and significant diplomatic breakthroughs of the 20th century, the Camp David Summit of 1978. Over 13 tense days, American President Jimmy Carter brought together Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to negotiate a peace agreement that changed the trajectory of the Middle East. But before we step inside the cabins of Camp David, let's set the historical scene. This is a summit that has its roots in decades of conflict and shifting political landscapes.
Yes, Russell, we could look back centuries to tease out the causes of the Middle East conflict. But in the interest of time, I think we should start with 1948, when Britain, hugely overstretched, simply pulled out of Palestine, which it had held as a mandate from the League of Nations since World War I. And in the vacuum that followed, the Jewish forces moved with particular speed and ruthlessness, gaining total victory over the neighbouring Arab states. The Jewish people, many of whom had fled persecution in Europe, gained their own state at last, Israel. But for the Palestinians, 1948 was the Nakba, or catastrophe. Some 750,000, according to UN estimates, were driven out or fled, ending up in squalid refugee camps in Jordan and the Gaza Strip along the Mediterranean coast. Israel's Arab neighbours became permanent and bitter enemies. They rejected Israel's right to exist as a state. So war and then more wars. 1948 is followed by 1956, when Egypt, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, seizes the Suez Canal and sees off a botched invasion by Britain and France in a clumsy conspiracy, really, you'd have to say, with Israel. And then there's 1967. Nasser's relentless pressure on Israel prompts a preemptive strike by the Israelis, destroying the air forces of Egypt, Jordan and Syria on the ground. And in the Six-Day War that follows, the Israelis capture the vast Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, right up to the Suez Canal. They also occupy the whole of Jerusalem, take the West Bank from Jordan, and the strategically important Golan Heights from Syria. Israel triples its size, at the cost of 759 lives.
So huge gains, but now the superpowers were being drawn in.
Yeah, well, clearly this is big stuff, and the Soviets react by breaking off diplomatic relations with Israel. They threw their weight behind Syria and Egypt. Thousands of Palestinians joined the terrorist PLO organization, which relocated to Lebanon. The international community, through UN Resolution 242, developed the principle of land for peace, meaning that Israel would return occupied territories in exchange for recognition and peace with its neighbours.
So the question in the early 1970s was how to translate that principle into realities on the ground, and it became even more urgent in 1973.
Yes, so in the next bout of warfare, it's the Arab states who surprised Israel. Egypt and Syria attacked during the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and again the superpowers are drawn in. The Soviets airlift massive amounts of supplies to Egypt. The Americans do the same to Israel. US forces worldwide are placed on DEFCON 3, the highest state of alert short of nuclear attack. For Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, the war had been a huge gamble, but it did help to restore Egypt's pride. This gave him some diplomatic leverage, and it now pulled America really into active regional diplomacy. Sadat knew that only the US had the capacity to put real pressure on Israel. The Americans did convert the ceasefire agreement into arrangements to disengage in Sinai and the Golan Heights, but disengagement wasn't peace.
Well, let's turn to the key leaders in the build-up to the summit and start with Sadat. He's a paradoxical figure, isn't he? A military man who becomes a peacemaker. Who was he?
Well, Sadat was born in 1918, the son of a poor official. As a young man, he joined secret nationalist groups determined to expel the British from Egypt, and he even conspired with German agents during World War II. He spent several years in a British prison. After the war, Sadat became a key ally of Nasser, joining the Free Officers movement that overthrew Egypt's monarchy in 1952. Sadat rises through the ranks. He becomes Nasser's vice president. Many deride him as being a sort of weak and ineffectual figure. His nickname is Major Yes Yes. But when Nasser dies in 1970 and Sadat takes over, he quickly consolidates power, but he also behaves more pragmatically than Nasser in foreign policy. Sadat believes that peace with Israel would free Egypt from this cycle of wars, and it would allow Egypt to regain the Sinai Peninsula lost in 1967 and focus on much-needed economic development and modernization.
And then, on the other side, in Israel, a very different kind of character.
Yes, indeed, yeah. So the Israeli leader, Menachem Begin, is a fascinating contrast. Intellectual, stubborn, focused on detail, and steeped in Jewish history and literature.
And this was also a man shaped by struggle.
Yes. Begin was born in what is now Belarus in 1913, and in his early life he experienced firsthand the anti-Semitic atrocities of World War II and particularly the Holocaust. He became a Zionist, passionately committed to the goal of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and in the 1940s he led the Irgun, which was a paramilitary group that fought for Israeli independence. In 1946, in fact, Begin ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which housed the British headquarters in Palestine. 91 people were killed. After independence, he went into politics and spent decades in the political wilderness, leading the opposition against Israel's dominant Labour Party. Much to everyone's surprise, his Likud party came to power in 1977, and that made him Israel's first right-wing prime minister.
So very much a hardliner.
Yeah. Begin presented an uncompromising vision of Zionism and of Greater Israel, holding on to the territory Israel had gained in the Six-Day War. He viewed all of that as part of Israel's biblical homeland, and he rejected the UN's Land for Peace resolution. To Begin, land held by force was Israel's only guarantee of peace. Remember, this is a man who lost his father, his mother, his brother, and 2 nephews as victims of Hitler's so-called final solution to the Jewish question.
And then the third key protagonist in our story is, of course, Jimmy Carter, who became American president in 1977.
Yes, Carter's a very different kind of character from the last US president we discussed, Richard Nixon. Carter's an idealist with a conscience, deeply concerned about civil rights and human rights. He campaigned promising honesty and transparency after the Watergate scandal.
And he wasn't your typical Washington insider.
No, not at all. Carter was a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, which sounds rather basic, but it was in fact a serious business, but it was a totally different background from Nixon. He served in the US Navy. He rose to prominence as a progressive governor of Georgia. Now, his Southern Baptist faith was absolutely central to his identity. He taught Sunday school every week, even during his presidency, and indeed afterwards into his 90s. And he believed deeply in principles of justice and reconciliation. Influenced, I think, in particular by his mother, Lillian Carter, she challenged racial taboos in the segregated South of that time, treating black patients during her work as a nurse. Carter said it was her sense of fairness and compassion that shaped his own commitment to human rights. Carter's also deeply influenced by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And his moral compass, if you like, extends to foreign policy as well. He has a passionate belief in personal diplomacy as a way to resolve conflicts peacefully, talking to the other guy. That's all very striking. But despite that genuine desire for peace on earth, Carter also has very good strategic reasons for his focus on the Middle East.
Let me guess, oil?
Yes, exactly. The region's stability was crucial for global energy supplies. Oil prices had soared after the Yom Kippur War when the Arab oil cartel, OPEC, got going. But Carter also believed, aside from oil, that a lasting peace between Egypt and Israel would help stabilize the region and keep Soviet influence in check.
So how did the summit come about?
Well, I think you'd have to say slowly at first. Carter met Sadat in Washington in April 1977, and they hit it off personally. Carter liked Sadat's frankness, his bold manner. Sadat was a very effusive man. He would later call Carter my very best friend on earth. And he liked the fact that Carter was a farmer, a religious man, true to his principles. And Carter had also served in the military like Sadat, though Carter was a Navy man, not a soldier. It's worth saying, I think, if we're thinking about Summitry more generally, that despite all the planning that goes into a successful summit, as we saw with Kissinger in 1972, what's often crucial is whether the men at the very top click instinctively, or at least think they can click. Now, Sadat had a hunch that he could trust Carter. And in November 1977, he sticks his neck above the parapet. He tells the Egyptian parliament that he, Sadat, is willing to go to the ends of the earth for peace, even to the Israeli parliament. So Begin takes this proposal seriously, and he issues a formal invitation for Sadat to come and speak to the Israeli parliament.
That's a huge gamble by Sadat.
Yeah, I mean, this is a man who has a flair for the dramatic. No Arab leader had ever acknowledged Israel's legitimacy so openly, let alone visited its capital. Of course, it's a sign that how desperately Sadat needed peace. And the visit isolated Egypt from much of the Arab world. The PLO called it apostasy. But Sadat was not deflected. And as a man with a sense of the PR, he was ready to give interviews to all three main US television networks as a way of building up his support in the United States. So in this battle, if you like, for American opinion, Begin has now got to follow suit. He presents himself in a softer light, and he gets sucked into the sort of soaring expectations that have now been generated by Sadat's dramatic diplomacy. In December 1977, Begin proposes a phased Israeli withdrawal from Sinai, and he offers a plan for a degree of autonomy or self-rule for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. though the details and the question of sovereignty is left vague. Sadat wants more concessions.
And so it's now that Carter gets involved as a mediator.
Yes, so you could say that the parameters of Middle Eastern diplomacy have been set by Sadat and Begin. But it's clear that there wouldn't be any radical breakthrough if matters were left to them alone.
It's a real gamble by Carter inviting two deeply opposed leaders together for talks. It was a huge political risk with no guarantee of success.
Yes, that's right, I think. Failure at Camp David could have been a political disaster for Carter. And remember, this is just months before the 1978 midterm elections. There's absolutely no guarantee of success. Carter can see that Sadat is facing an immense backlash across the Arab world. Many of them depict his overtures to Israel as a total betrayal. And in Israel, Begin is under considerable pressure from settlers who have no intention of giving up land that they've acquired thanks to Israel's conquests.
So it's high stakes all round. We've done the why and the who. Now the where. Why was Camp David chosen as the venue for these talks?
Well, because nobody else could go there. Camp David was a secure US government property offering total seclusion. Carter wanted a place not too far from Washington, in this case it was just about 60 miles or so, but removed from the distractions of the US Capitol and its awful summer heat, and also with minimal dangers of leaks to the media. The physical layout of Camp David is also ideal. It's a cluster of small cabins in the wooded mountains of Maryland, rustic but comfortable. Each leader would have his own lodge, and it was hoped that being in isolation together would encourage them to engage directly with one another.
You know him as a British bulldog and World War II hero, but who was the real Winston Churchill? New history podcast Creating Churchill explores the man behind the myth, how Churchill's life and legacy were shaped by relationships with tricky allies like Roosevelt and Stalin, enemies including Hitler and Gandhi, and his wife and most devoted critic, Clemmy. With fresh psychological insight and untold stories, Creating Churchill, available now on your favourite podcast app.
Before we get into the summit itself, how did this presidential retreat come into being?
Oh, it's an interesting story. Camp David was a New Deal recreation camp commandeered in 1942 by Franklin Roosevelt and turned into a presidential retreat. And after him, most presidents have used Camp David in their own ways. Dwight Eisenhower loved it. He, in fact, was the man who renamed it Camp David after his grandson. John F. Kennedy held informal meetings there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was Richard Nixon's bolt hole for long periods during the Watergate scandal. I think he wrote his resignation speech there in 1974.
Right. So on to Carter in 1978. This president sees Camp David not just as a personal retreat, but as a tool for diplomacy, and diplomacy of a different type from normal convention, less formal, more human.
Exactly, yes. Being at Camp David strips away much of the pomp and ceremony that can ensnarl diplomacy. The hope was that it would encourage more flexible and creative thinking from both sides. The Americans had considered, it's interesting to know, they considered bugging the Israeli and Egyptian lodges, but Carter forbade that, which meant he denied himself, if you like, the advantage Stalin had gained at Tehran and Yalta. However, the other delegations seemed to have assumed that they were being bugged anyway, and they tended to hold sensitive conversations outside on the porch. Carter would often stroll from lodge to lodge. He would hold informal gatherings. He was often dressed in jeans and a t-shirt to help foster a relaxed atmosphere. Sadat followed him with casual attire, but Begin, true to form, I think, stayed in a jacket and tie. The wooded surroundings did allow for personal moments. Carter took walks in the forest with Sadat to discuss philosophy as well as the summit, while Begin preferred quiet reflection in his lodge. Even so, the tension was palpable. Sadat and Begin avoided each other outside the formal sessions, preferring to remain with their own delegations, and there was a personality clash between the rather theatrical Sadat and Begin with his meticulous, legalistic style, which relied heavily on documents, detailed maps, and hard-nosed argument that sometimes really veered into sheer bloody-mindedness.
So for 13 days, starting on the 5th of September 1978, this isolated setting became the stage for one of the most intense diplomatic efforts in history, really.
Yeah. Well, I think staged is the right word, Russell. As a director, you'll appreciate Carter's position. He's brought the participants together. He's thought long and hard about their roles. You might say even the lines he'd like them to say. In contrast to Roosevelt and Churchill, he's immersed himself in the briefing books, often pushing back against his diplomats and his aides. And remember, the three of them all speak decent English. This is the benefit of their being victims of British imperialism. So they can all speak their minds directly, without need of interpreters.
But there's a limit to the director analogy. Carter's leading actors here are prima donnas with scripts of their own. There's going to be a lot of improvisation, which Carter can't really control.
Yes, that's true. And he's thrown, in fact, right at the start. Sadat, who doesn't trust Begin, decides to open by setting out Egypt's maximum demands, including Israel's withdrawal from all the occupied territories and the removal of all Israeli settlements. Now, he intends this to be an emphatic opening statement from parts of which he would then gradually back down, with Carter helping to broker an eventual agreement.
How did Begin react to the opening statement by Egypt?
Well, I think you'd have to say with suppressed fury. He keeps his cool that afternoon, but next morning he goes through a lengthy point-by-point rebuttal of everything Sadat had said. And Begin declares at one point, "This smacks of a victorious state dictating peace to the defeated." Carter decides not to try and stage manage things anymore. He sits at his desk, head down, and keeps taking notes, while Begin and Sadat went at it and at each other, hammer and tongs, for much of day 2. By the evening, both of them actually seemed ready to abandon the summit. Eventually, Carter persuades them not to go home, but they left the room without speaking. And in fact, day 2 of Camp David proved to be the last occasion for a Big Three meeting.
Wow, so the curtain coming down after the first act. How did Carter keep the show going?
Well, through a complete change of tack. Shuttle diplomacy. He works up proposals with his aides, and he then takes them to one side and then to the other, going to and fro between the various lodges. Well, actually, that's a simplification. Going to selected people on each side, because a good many in each delegation have already given up on the whole process. Among the Egyptians, Carter speaks mostly with Sadat, who was way out of step with his colleagues, not least his own foreign minister.
And how did Carter handle the Israelis?
Well, he had to talk to Begin, obviously. But the Prime Minister infuriated the President and most of the US team by his intransigence and his legalistic point scoring. So wherever possible, Carter tries to include Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan and Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann in these discussions with Begin. Both of them accepted at least the principle of a land for peace deal. And that's where the proximity and informality of Camp David really helps. If all this had been done in Washington, the world's media would have kept track of every time that a limo from the Israeli embassy or the Egyptian embassy arrives at the White House. At Camp David, the president and also his aides could talk and work quietly and persistently on key Israelis and Egyptians. And they mixed hard talk with moments of relaxation, walking together and playing tennis or chess. Though it has to be said that the Camp David Summiters were men who couldn't imagine playing anything except to win.
Did any of this softly diplomacy have an effect, particularly on Begin?
Well, on the evening of day 4, he did invite Carter and Carter's wife to join the Israelis for their Friday dinner. The food was good, the singing was hearty, and the mood was almost amiable. But it wasn't just a social occasion, because Carter had now told both leaders that he would soon be offering his own framework for a peace deal. And I think Begin did not wish to become totally isolated. He might be in danger of being depicted as the wrecker if everything fell apart.
So would you say this was the crucial breakthrough?
No, it wasn't, actually. All that happened really that evening was that Carter's Middle East team started work on the American framework document. And wait for it, that document would go through 23 drafts, 23, before the summit came to an end.
Gosh. So now we're at the end of day 4, and the summit didn't finish until when? Day 13, September the 17th. How did Carter just keep them all at the summit all that time?
Well, through lots more stage management, and I think you'd have to say a good deal of fancy footwork. One thing that really mattered, I think, was that he let them out of confinement for a few hours. By this point, Carter's guests are getting cabin fever. They're cooped up in Camp David under dark trees when all these men are used to arid, sunlit, open spaces. Sadat said Camp David reminded him of his World War II days in a British prison. The Israelis joked bleakly about the concentration camp. And Carter's press secretary, Jody Powell, was getting it in the neck from the world's media. They couldn't come into Camp David, of course. They had to cool their heels in a little town some 6 miles away, with not many amenities. Every day, Powell would come down from the summit to give a 30-minute briefing. But he had, to put it bluntly, little red meat to offer the big beasts of the American press. They certainly weren't satisfied with kind of morsels like President Sadat went for a stroll yesterday afternoon and ran into Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Begin, who were touring the premises in a golf cart.
Well, I can understand why that wouldn't have gone down well with the likes of Walter Cronkite. So how does Carter manage a get-out-of-jail moment for his campers?
He takes them to Gettysburg.
Not to fight, presumably.
No, to see the battlefield. So Gettysburg is a 45-minute drive from Camp David, so easy to get to for a sort of Sunday afternoon excursion. And it's worth remembering that many of the Israelis and Egyptians were military men. At Staff College, they would have pored over that brutal 3-day battle in July 1863, which was the turning point of the American Civil War. So now they were fascinated in 1978 to walk and talk the terrain, with Carter himself as one of their guides. And it's also true to say that the trip was a welcome relief for the media, because they're now starting to air reports that the summit's run into some serious problems. Instead, the Sunday evening news and Monday morning papers were full of images and reports about the leaders at selected spots around Gettysburg. Much juicier for people like Walter Cronkite than having to spin out pieces to camera next to the Camp David sign at the bottom of the hill.
But all good things must come to an end. So what happens when they have to go back to jail in Camp David?
Well, then all hell breaks loose. Once the buses return to Camp David, Carter reviews the latest draft of the American Framework Plan for a comprehensive settlement, and then at 4 p.m. he tries it out on the Israelis. Begin hits the roof. He goes through the draft proposal point by point, and the tirade goes on until 3 in the morning. Carter, exhausted, refers to him privately as a psycho.
Wow. What about the Egyptians? When did they get a look in?
Next day, so that's Monday, September the 11th, day 7. This is after Carter's only had 4 hours of sleep. He's anxious to keep the furious Begin in play, so he incorporates some of the Israeli points in a revised draft, which he shares with Sadat on Monday morning. Although there's no outburst from Sadat, his entourage are furious that Carter's document says nothing about Israel giving up Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. For them, these are essential parts of the Arab case. And Egyptian Foreign Minister Mohammed Kamel urges Sadat to walk away from the summit if these demands aren't met. In fact, such is the friction now in the Egyptian delegation that on Tuesday morning, Carter, who was by chance returning from a bike ride, witnesses a flaming row among the Egyptians on the porch of Sadat's cottage. In fact, Foreign Minister Kamel would resign rather than sign the Camp David Accords. On the other side, Begin remains intransigent. On Tuesday evening, he lays into Carter again, and he's resorting, as so often, to biblical language. He keeps shouting, "Better my right hand should lose its cunning than I sign such a document." Now, Begin's prone to these kind of emotional outbursts when he feels his country's under threat. But one does sense, I think, some deliberate melodrama to push Carter onto the defensive.
So it seems that the American Framework document brings matters to a head, but not in the way that Carter wants.
No.
And the result really is crisis, not compromise. What does Carter do about it? What does he do next?
Well, it's now clear that he's the one who's got to compromise. Not just because of the apparently unbridgeable gulf between Sadat and Begin. And, let's stop for a moment. When we focus on one historical event like a summit, we have to remember that leaders in real time in the real world don't have that luxury of just focusing on one event. To borrow Donald Rumsfeld's famous line, stuff happens. And it keeps on happening, whether you want it to or not, usually at the most inconvenient moments.
Let me guess, David, is this the moment you're going to mention Iran?
Yep. Hole in one, Russell. And it's a very big hole. During 1978, protests mount in Tehran against the autocratic Shah of oil-rich Iran, one of America's key allies in the Middle East. And as the crisis deepens, the Shah oscillates between reform and repression. But as order collapses, he imposes martial law. And the next day, Friday, September the 8th, there are mass protests in Tehran, during which dozens of protesters are killed by troops and police. So that's Black Friday, as it was called. And that is also day 4 of the Camp David summit. From then on, Carter has to devote hours each day to the escalating crisis, and he has to do so whilst in only rudimentary contact with Washington at Camp David.
It's extraordinary timing, and that increases the pressure, presumably, to end this summit with some kind of deal, even if it's not everything he wants.
Yes, exactly. He's helped here, I think, by his perception that what Sadat really wants is peace between Egypt and Israel. The question or the issue of regional peace across the Middle East is a secondary issue for Sadat. And that helps push Carter towards the idea of a split deal.
Which means what?
Well, it means a detailed agreement between Begin and Sadat centered on Israel's phased withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, one of its prizes from the 1967 war. But alongside that Egypt-Israel peace, a much looser document agreeing a framework for a regional peace process.
So the looser document would then leave the fate of the other occupied territories for the future?
Yes, but it's interesting to note what William Quandt, said he was a senior official on the National Security Council, and he observed privately that in these kind of negotiations, Quandt said, there comes a time when one opts for clarity at risk of reaching no agreement at all, or settling for vagueness, which means postponing problems until a later date. And Quandt said, towards the end of the Camp David discussions, on the West Bank and Gaza, we have chosen to postpone until a later date what cannot be solved today. The other thing that helps Carter, I think, is that by this stage in the summit, he and his staff have discovered people on the other delegations with whom they could work. One of them's Aharon Barak, Israel's Attorney General. He's a tough but realistic lawyer and also an excellent draftsman. In other words, very good with words in English and in other languages, which is crucial for this kind of agreement. Another figure that they suss out is Osama El-Baz, the Egyptian Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs. He's got similar credentials, and he's also taken the lead in critiquing the earlier American document, and therefore it could be assumed that he could speak for the Egyptian hardliners. He knew what their bottom lines were.
So, David, finally home and dry.
Sarcasm, I assume, there, Russell. You've been at Camp David far too long to expect that. The idea of a split deal begins to take shape on the evening of Monday the 11th, day 7. But the drafting and the redrafting takes hours. Carter here is now relying heavily on his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and his National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, plus their staffs to sort out all the wording that's going to work for both sides. And that takes ages and it's meticulous work. There are also continuing pyrotechnic displays from the two main leaders. They're increasingly worried now about reaction to any deal back home. And so there's plenty of tirades. And at one point on Friday the 15th, Vance bursts into Carter's lodge, he's white-faced, and he's shouting, "Sadat is leaving! Sadat is leaving! He and his aides are already packed. He asked me to order him a helicopter."
What did Carter do?
Well, according to his memoirs, he prayed fervently for a few minutes in private. Then he put on more formal clothes, he said, because of the gravity of the moment, and he marched down to Sadat's lodge. Speaking quietly but firmly, he told the Egyptian president that if he left now, it would mean the end of the relationship between Egypt and the US. It would mean the end of the US peacemaking effort, and it would probably mean the end of Carter's presidency. Not to mention, he said, quote, the end of something that is very precious to me, my friendship with you. Sadat was deeply shaken. He huffs and puffs for a few minutes and then he just exclaims, "I shall sign anything proposed by President Carter without reading it."
Wow, a roller coaster right to the very end.
Yes. By the weekend, Carter's desperate to avoid having another week away from Washington. And Barak in particular can sense this. And that enabled him to trim away further points that were particularly sensitive for the Israelis. But anyway, Carter is able to get his campers back to Washington in time to announce the Camp David Accords in the East Room of the White House at 10:30 on Sunday night.
So success at last and a huge boost for Carter. Even Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State and a self-styled master of geopolitics, called it a very major achievement.
Yes, and it was. But then the loose ends begin to emerge. The Camp David Accords commit Egypt and Israel to conclude a formal peace treaty within 3 months. But this treaty was not signed until the end of March 1979. And then only after an intense week of shuttle diplomacy by Carter himself, flying to and fro between Cairo and Jerusalem. or rather more complicated than walking between one lodge and the other. One of those loose ends that's never tied up is what Carter believed was a clear verbal promise from Begin to freeze further Jewish settlements in the occupied territories. The evidence on this remains fuzzy, but the Americans are absolutely clear later that they should have got that in writing before Begin left Camp David.
Because there he was still in jail, as it were.
Yes, so you'd have to say, I think, that Carter's strategy of taking the two leaders out of normal politics and up to the summit had initially paid off. He did secure the Egypt-Israel deal, the most significant peace agreement in the tortured history of the modern Middle East. But as the conference drags on, it's Carter who becomes imprisoned at the summit. He has to come down with something, and that meant in the end leaving most of the Israel-Palestine issues, as distinct from Israel-Egypt issues, to another day.
And that's a day, of course, that has yet to dawn.
Yes, sadly so. But Carter made the most serious and sincere effort of any US president to deal with these issues. But it's interesting that Brzezinski warned Carter just before the summit began. Brzezinski wrote this: Sadat cannot afford a failure, and he knows it. Both Sadat and Begin think you cannot afford failure. But Begin probably believes that a failure at Camp David will hurt you and Sadat, but not him.
True comment, and worth bearing in mind for anyone going into negotiations, I suppose. Which of us will be least damaged by failure?
Yeah. And there are personal costs of this whole process as well. If you think about the epilogue, if you like, the later story, Carter's success at Camp David is eclipsed by the escalating Iran hostage crisis, which helps lose him the presidency in 1980 to Ronald Reagan. Sadat is denounced in much of the Arab world for recognizing Israel's right to exist. And in 1981, he's gunned down during a military parade in Cairo by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And Begin is not untouched as well. He might have come out best, if you like, from the summit, but his last years are miserable. In 1982, he launched an assault into Lebanon, and the aim there was to push back Palestinian militias. But the war escalates, and it leads to the siege of Beirut and the massacre of 700 Palestinian inhabitants of refugee camps by Lebanese militia allied to Israel. There's a huge backlash at home in Israel and around the world. And Begin is, I think, deeply hurt by the damage these actions have done to Israel's image of moral superiority because of the Holocaust. That was something he kept playing on at Camp David. Begin resigns as Prime Minister in 1983. He spends the last decade of his life in seclusion and in deepening depression.
David, thank you for bringing this complex summit to life for us. Next time on Creating History, the Cold War reaches its denouement as we explore the remarkable and unexpected bromance, really, that developed between Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and American President Ronald Reagan. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.